Hi, my name is Daria Mezentseva and welcome to Politeka World Show. In today's show, we'll talk about the following. Sanctions against the Russian economy. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the cost of Western sanctions on Russia is mounting daily, making it more difficult for Moscow to replenish its weaponry to advance its ongoing war in Ukraine. Will today's partners save Russia? And how long Russia could afford to finance the war in Ukraine? Will the European Union oil embargo hurt the Russian war machine? We'll talk about it and about much more things with an economist, investment specialist, founder of the Movchan Group, Movchan. Andrei, I'm happy to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm also happy to be here in these unfortunate circumstances, unfortunately, but still, let's talk.
Yeah, thank you for taking part in this show. From the situation in Russian economy. So you wrote a lot about Russian economy and about the influence of the war between Ukraine and Russia. And you told that Russia will be in the isolation from the world, and it will be the sharp decline in social functions such as medical care and sharp reduction in the range of goods with no chance of recovery over time, and so on, so on, so on. You told about death of science and education. So let's understand on which stage is the Russian struggles of the economy right now? How long is to its bottom?
Well, that's a very good question, because it is very frequently misunderstood by the world when we talk about Russia. That Russian economy is, as any economy in the world, very resilient to the shocks. There is no economy that crumbles because of the external shock. All the economies continue to live, to work, even in North Korea, even in Iran. We know that in Iran there is a decent economy working under sanctions for more than 40 years. The Russian economy obviously deteriorates. Deterioration started long ago. The peak year was 2013. And after that, Russian economy never repeated itself in terms of the efficiency and the size. Obviously, with the beginning of the war, with the outbreak of the aggression and the appearance of the sanction, the imposition of the sanctions, Russian economy began to deteriorate much quicker. We expect the Russian GDP to fall in a range of about 4 to 7% this year. It's very hard to give more accurate estimations because the statistics is mostly closed, mostly hidden now. The household income should, according to our estimates, go down by about 10% this year on average. Again, it's very hard to prove or to check, because the majority of the statistics is hidden, and the part of the statistics that we are able to retrieve is quite self-contradictory. We understand that the supply of goods in Russia is limited. The imports fell as much as about 50% on average in the beginning of the war. Now there is a slight recovery. Maybe the imports are about 20-25% less than they were a year ago, month to month. The internal production of non-military goods suffered about a 10% decline. And obviously the limitations to the securities markets, the limitations to the currency markets impose a different investment climate, and we can expect that the investments in Russia this year would be close to zero, and next year they probably would not grow, which means that the perspectives of the economy are even more gloom than they were before the aggression starts.
And also we just must understand the last, for example, quotes. For example, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that the cost of Western sanctions on Russia is mounting daily, making it more difficult for Moscow to replenish its weaponry to advance its ongoing war with Ukraine. So From the economic side, Andrei, how it influences the way how Russia could support the war in Ukraine. So all these figures, does it mean they don't have enough when they use, for example, the money from welfare fund?
Well, the question is very good, and unfortunately, I have bad news for you on that side. Usually, when people talk about that subject, they mix unmixable substances. Like what you just did. You were talking about the sovereign fund. You're talking about the resources for the supporting of the military aggression. And if we decompose the situation, we will see that first, Russia receives and still receives and will receive enough currency-denominated resources to import specifically important components for the military equipment and for the production of the military goods. Whether it is in a gray area, whether it is legal, whether it is sanctions being done, avoiding the international regulation, or is being done legally, doesn't matter much. Russia doesn't need much quantities of these microchips, for example, or these alloys to support their military production. Russia finds ways to do it and will find ways to do it in the future. Maybe not in the desired quantities, but in sufficient quantities to continue to support the aggression. On the other hand, when we talk about the internal resources are not measured in terms of sovereign fund resources or the central bank resources. Russia is sovereign above its own currency. It may print its own currency, it may distribute its own currency in the way they want to distribute it. They will still have enough money to pay the workers in the military plants. They will still have enough resources to feed them. And with that regard, nothing just changed. They are free to decide whether to use the sovereign fund or to print money or to raise internal debt or even to raise external debts with the countries which do not support the sanctions. Just for you to understand me better, you can see at other examples in the world. Countries like Zimbabwe, countries like Iraq, countries like Iran or North Korea, they're still able to produce weaponry, they're still able to buy weapons, they're still able to maintain aggressions, to maintain wars. North Korea is now having successes in launching ballistic missiles. Iran is even supplying Russia with the drones and the missiles. Its weaponry is even better than Russian one. With that regard, I would not rely on the sanctions as mechanics, as a way to prevent Russia from being able to continue the aggression.
So even secondary sanctions won't be effective in this case?
Just don't look at Russia, look at Iran. There are direct sanctions and there are secondary sanctions and there are comprehensive sanctions. And still Iran produces drones and missiles, which it supplies Russia with. And its drones and missiles are in abundant quantities and are better than Russian ones. And the sanctions do not interfere with that.
Yeah, and the fact that $300 billion frozen by Western countries, which has a significant share of assets related to the fund, National Welfare Fund, does it mean nothing for a Russian economy and its sustainability?
No, well, literally, it means nothing for Russian economy because it was never used in Russian economy before. These were the reserves which were, in a sense, hidden from Russian economy. They were put elsewhere in the international markets, in the international debt obligations, and the non-existence of them for today doesn't change anything within Russia, within the economy, within the ability of Russia to pay its debts or to buy weaponry, for example.
Yeah. Understood you. And if we're talking about the situation with Russian reserves, we know that a lot of Russian reserves are frozen in France, in Japan, in Germany, USA, and Austria, and it's not a small sum of money, but still, if we're talking about China reserves, they have them in liquidity. It's around 80 billion, and also in Russia, they have reserves in gold. So how much is it for Russian economy? Does it gives a lot of gap to finance the war in Ukraine?
Well, we need to understand first that Russia doesn't need the reserves to finance anything. Russian current account is positive. Each day, each month, Russia gets more currency than it uses, than it utilizes. The reserves are increasing. And even countries without the reserves at all, like Turkey, for example. The Turkish economy has no reserves at all as of today. And if you account for the currency swaps, the Turkish reserves are negative. Still, Turkish economy works as one of the big economies in the world, and Turkish military is even stronger than the Russian military, as a matter of fact. With that regard, unless in the future Russian current account becomes deeply negative, and the only way to reach that point is not to buy oil from Russia, and this is hardly achievable nowadays. And if it does not happen, Russia will be able to finance the war out of its current incomes.
Mm-hmm. And if we're talking about the oil, so now we have oil embargo on oil products, on its refined products and the oil. So also we have now a cap. The cap price of Russian oil at $60 a barrel. So how such measures limit Russian ability to profit and ensure supply meets demand, or there can be used more effective options to minimize profit from oil?
Well, it is very wrong to use the word embargo, first instance, because there is no embargo, actually. Europe and a couple other countries decided not to buy Russian oil delivered by sea.
So all experts, they are mistaken, and I don't know, President Biden mistaken when they tell about embargo of the oil? It's a wrong word here.
We have to admit that this is a phraseological mistake. Mm-hmm. When Europe refuses to buy Russian oil, Europe still buys oil from elsewhere, and the other sources need to be fed by oil in order to be able to supply the oil to Europe. So this is just a redistribution of the flows, and at the end of the day, even the most hawkish analysts assume that Russia will lose about 1 million barrels a day of the exports, out of about approximately 5 million barrels a day. So it's about 20% of lost. That's one. The other thing is that the price ceiling at $60 per barrel is already above the price Russia is selling its oil. The current price for Russian oil, ex-Russian port, is about $57 per barrel. So at the moment, the ceiling doesn't change almost anything. It may change in the future if the oil price goes back high and Russia would not be able to sell higher than the ceiling. Again, to the countries that approve of the ceiling, that stick to these sanctions, and many countries can legally or semi-legally avoid the fulfillment of these rules. But imagine all countries in the world stick to that, and Russia sells at current price, for example, which is lower than 60 per barrel. Then Russia still receives about $80 billion a year from the oil sales. And in 2019, Russia received as much as $120 billion of sales. This is like $40 million less, which is a big deal, of course, for Russia. And $40 billion is a very high figure, but it's not dramatic, specifically given the fact that the banned capital flows outside Russia, as well as banned tourist outflows, outside Russia, both banned by European countries, by the way, save many more billions of dollars for Russia every year.
And what measures would be more effective? I know that you talked about some, for example, about another features that could be involved in this market, so the Russia could could struggle more.
So we talk about concerning the oil market specifically. We spoke, and many prominent economists spoke about the excise rather than the ceiling, about a tax imposed on the buyers of Russian oil. So whenever you buy Russian oil, at whatever price you buy Russian oil, that's your problem. You pay, for example, $40 per barrel in excise dedicated to the reconstruction fund of Ukraine. Being adopted on the American level, on the European level, on the level of the NATO countries, this would be the necessary payment for all countries in the world, unless they want to be subject to secondary sanctions. These situations happened in the past and were very successful. For example, with the titanium, this worked some years ago, and was easy to administer, and was easy to collect, and was easy to impose. Unfortunately, none of the officials wanted to listen to us. On the other hand, we may take $40 to $50 billion more out of Russian budget each year by this measure, but at the same time, if we do not allow free capital outflows from Russia, we would keep all the rest inside the Kremlin possession. That's why we were opposing the Western measures of sanctioning the Russian banks, sanctioning the Russian residents from getting their money into Europe.
So what you said right now, so we couldn't see that Europe, for example, is ready to punish enough Putin and the Putin regime right now. Does it mean this when we see like situation like that?
It is not a matter of punishment. We're not in kindergarten. We're not kids. We're all mature countries. That's a matter of the rationality. That's a matter of the solution to the problem. If we need to stop Russia from attacking Ukraine, if we need to prevent Russia from attacking Ukraine in the future, we need to build up the situation where Russia is incapable of doing that.
Yes.
And by allowing Kremlin to accumulate all the funds inside Russia, in the Russian perimeter, we act on behalf of Kremlin rather than against Kremlin. Punishing simple people in Russia, ordinary people who cannot move their money abroad and who can take their money from Europe back in Russia, is an irrational move. We can well believe that all Russians are responsible for the aggression, which in my mind is not true and is not just, but it doesn't matter. Even if we believe so, by limiting the outflows of funds out of Russia, we play into the hand of Kremlin.
Yeah, but what do you think is what could be happen in the future? For example, what steps should be done by Europe to make Russia incapable to finance the military involvement and the war at all?
No, I can propose a bold statement. European states need to lift all the limitations on the outflows of capital out of Russia. First, all the limitations on the tourism and usage of the international credit cards in Europe, even if they are issued in Russia. Allow people to take as much capital out of Russia as they want, and millions of people and hundreds of thousands of Russian millionaires will use the first chance to do it, of course. Capitals flee from the war, not to the war. The Europe needs to strike a deal with the billionaires sanctioned now in order to secure that their capital stays in Europe and not goes to the third countries and subsequently not appears in Russia, in the Russian perimeter. At the same time, it is possible to impose an excise on Russian oil instead of the ceiling that doesn't work in reality. and strengthen the sanctions against the military institutions, against the officials and people directly involved in the aggression or taking part in the aggression, and all the dual purpose things and the military production and everything that directly supports the war. I think that's clear enough.
So, and Europe isn't ready, as we understand, yes, for these steps.
Well, I cannot speak on the account of Europe. I would rather allow Europe to speak for itself. But my interactions with the deputies of the Euro Parliament, for example, show that they still speak rather and think rather from the moral standpoint than the practical standpoint. Unfortunately, in the situations of war, the moral standpoint should be subjugated to the cynical and rational decisions. We need to stop the war. We need to secure that Ukraine wins the war, that the peace is restored, that Russia is incapable of counterattacking Ukraine in the future. And even if our moral grounds are a little bit shaken at that point, I would sacrifice that for the success.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to talk with you a little bit about inner situation in Russia. So as I could hear from different experts, economic experts in Ukraine and abroad, so they tell that Russia is ready to be like second North Korea, yeah? And furthermore, we could see that around 70,000 citizens have already been killed on the front line, and around 3 million of Russian citizens are in immigration. So what does it bring to production field and technology sectors in Russia?
The answer would be contradictory by itself, unfortunately, as is the economy itself. Right. I cannot help admitting that the immigration of about 2 million people, 2 million welfare people and better educated people generally, and most of them are professionals, is a hard hit for Russian high-tech economy. Anyway, we know that. There is no sense denying that. At the same time, we know that North Korea has all means and ways of producing high-tech equipment and vehicles, including the military ones, which means that military production does not need all the resources a rich country like Russia has. They will survive even with what's left. And again, the more restrictive is the European policy towards the immigrants, the more restrictive it is towards Russian capital, the more resources are left for Russia to build upon their military strength.
Yeah, and if we're talking about manufacturing part, manufacturing sector, so for now, how we could estimate the situation in this field in Russia?
The general manufacturing is affected by the loss of the international cooperators, much more than by the sanctions itself. For example, the automotive sector is in deep shock because the European automotive producers left the cooperation. They stopped the assembly of the cars in Russia. The Chinese will gradually take their place. As of today, the production is very low. In years to come, if nothing generally changes, the production will be substituted by using the Chinese models, by cooperation with the Chinese. Russia will be deeply dependent in terms of the manufacturing on the Chinese R&D and the Chinese cooperation in terms of spare parts and inputs, but will produce enough cars, enough brown and white devices, enough other goods to supply to the internal population. And of course, we have to understand that Russia deliberately becomes a satellite and independent of China, a client of China, a country that will need to accept Chinese rules of the game and obey to the Chinese orders, because China becomes the monopolistic supplier, the monopolistic supporter of Russian economy. But within that frame and within that circumstances, Russia will be able to produce enough goods to avoid large shortages and problems on the supply side.
And how do you feel about military manufacturing in Russia? We heard here about usage of Russia, the Soviet military stuff. Does it still in real?
We have no clear evidence of Russians having started the military cooperation with China as of today. I cannot say that it doesn't take place. I do not know. But again, there are no clear signs of that. With regards to the usage of the Soviet equipment, it's rather a rational move by Russian military. It's like first come, first serve, right? First in, first out. You use your older equipment first, and then you use your newer one. You try to save.
Yeah, but we hear another information. Excuse me to interrupt you. So that they started to use this old Soviet equipment, military stuff, because they don't have enough of a good one.
Well, the old Soviet equipment is not bad, actually. Or even the tanks produced in the 70s are still work, and they still solve their tasks. And we shouldn't lie to ourselves with regards to the quality of the Russian new equipment. All these super modern tanks like T-90 and super new missiles, they are not more than the modernizations of the older versions. And sometimes the modernizations are not that good and not that perfect. We see that the unbeatable T-90 tanks are being destroyed in Ukraine every day as well. So, with that regard, there is no big difference between the older one and the newer one. Obviously, the Russian military cannot produce the military equipment on par with the destruction speed on the front. The war is very bloody, and the war is very intense in terms of the destruction of the Russian equipment. Russians lose an airplane a day, a couple helicopters a day, a dozen tanks a day, and they only can produce probably one or two planes a month. The reserves will be exhausted, but we need to be realistic about the pace. It will probably take 2 or 3 more years to get to the bottom of the Russian military reserves.
Yeah, and what do you think about the influence of China on Russia? Do you agree with the version that Russia could become the province of China in a few years, in 10 years, or something like that?
Well, as much as I understand the Chinese policy, and my understanding obviously is limited, Chinese do not need provinces. They need satellites, which are marginal profit for them. Which they do not spend money on controlling the territory. They do not spend money on arranging for the economy. They do not mess in international affairs and failures of these territories. They need to use the territories to arrange for the supply of the mineral resources at lower prices, to move out the dirty industries, to use the human resources supply and so on. They do it in Africa. They do it in Indochina. They will do it in Russia, indeed. I have little doubts that in 5 to 10 years they will decide who rules in Russia. But not more. Mm-hmm. Chinese are not interested in military cooperation because the weights of the armies are vastly different. And Russian army is definitely not the best army in the world, and Chinese army is one of the strongest armies in the world. They do not need such a friend, and they do not want to share the responsibility for Russian affairs. I would say even more, if Russia fails, if Russia loses the war, it's even better for the Chinese, because with that regard, Russia would not be in a position of negotiating the place in the world, and Russians would need to go to China as the one and only support. With that regard, I would not expect China to supply Russia with weapons, for example.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about the situation in Great Britain with the Russian money. So we know that around 2 billion Russian assets are frozen in Great Britain. So you live in London since 2019. So what can we observe today? What happens now with these assets? You said in one of the interviews that you have now more work according to all this situation in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. So what could you observe right now?
No, well, I am a founding partner of an international investment management company. Where we obviously, given the roots, we obviously worked with Russian investors before the aggression. We still work with quite a few Russian clients. Fortunately, they now fall out of the spectrum of the limitations by European Commission because they have the citizenships or the leaves to remain in other countries outside Russia, and the vast majority of them, even 100% of them, are outside Russia. Many of them left very soon after the outbreak of the crisis. But still, we have to undergo the much stricter compliance procedures. Everything takes much more time to be achieved. We had problems with almost all the banks and brokers. They put us on the watch list, and they did the additional compliance. They temporarily froze the accounts. We needed to explain many things to them. Now, hopefully, we're all clear. But again, you never know what new sanctions will bring and what new suspicions will arise, and what kind of things we'll need to do in the future. My logistics and operations were increased dramatically since the aggression because we needed to meet all the demands. And that's obviously the headache and the problem. I understand the roots of that, and I do not complain about that, but still, it's quite a hassle. Given the situation of the Great Britain, we have at least 500,000 people with the Russian roots, Russian-speaking people living in Great Britain. I know quite a few of them, many of them. None of them, except for a handful of oligarchs, have any problems. Again, there were additional checks, there were confusions at first, and now everything works quite smoothly. The Brits are generally compassionate both to Ukrainians and Russians, specifically Russians living in Great Britain. I haven't come across any hostilities. When there are meetings supporting Ukraine in Britain, there are Russians coming as well as Ukrainians, and nobody tries to differentiate. Nobody tries to find out whether you're Russian or you're Ukrainian. You speak Russian, you speak Ukrainian. We all speak against the war, and that's what is important. There are many initiatives supporting Ukraine launched by Russians, and many initiatives supporting Russian immigrants launched by Russians at the same time. Great Britain is full of Ukrainian flags. Usually you see at least one flag on each block of buildings in London. And official support for Ukraine is very high. When we talk about the public opinion, there are three remarkable things about the public opinion. First, the vast majority of Britons support Ukraine and want to continue to support Ukraine. The second thing is the same majority, like 80 to 85%, support the sanctions. And the third one is that the majority of the Britons do not support the increase of the sanctions against Russia. So they feel like there is enough sanctions imposed. So that's what I know about that.
Yeah, and how do you think, do British people fully understand the war in Ukraine and everything about it?
And well, it's a hard question. What does it mean to fully understand? I don't think many people fully understand the war in Ukraine anyway, because not many people know all the circumstances and understand the economic and geopolitical landscape.
Yeah, for example, American people, excuse me to interrupt you,
Yep.
so they didn't understand that, for example, the war started in 2014, realistically, yeah, not in 2022, 21st February, yeah. So many Americans, they didn't get it, yeah. So what about British people? How they understand what is the reasons, what is the start, and so on, so on.
Well, to be frank, the common Brits, they do not care that much about the circumstances and the situations. They're mostly, as all the people in the world, they're mostly driven by narratives. They read the newspapers. They see that Russia attacked Ukraine. They understand that the war is going on Ukraine territory. They know who the aggressor is. They support Ukraine, and they don't care much about the roots or when it started or how exactly it goes on. The specialists, people who have to understand the facts and the figures, they pretty much share the common understanding that the aggression was initiated in 2014. And it took time for Russia to regroup and to continue the aggression. And that's it. Many ask why the European countries and the US and the UK were not that decisive when the aggression started in the first instance.
Yeah, and also you said that Russian economies in 1914 and 2022 are very similar. So in that time, it was led to revolution. Do you observe such an outcome for Russia right now?
No, of course not. The economies were quite similar, of course. The social was very different, and the scale of the war, the magnitude of war, is vastly different. The First World War was the global war for Russia. Russia lost millions of people, and Russia had to mobilize millions of people. And the overall, the general situation in Russia was different because of that. Now the war is regional. And the losses in a range of 100,000 people for the modern Russia are uncomparably less than the losses in the First World War. And the structure of the social structure of Russia is vastly different. With that regard, I wouldn't expect the revolution. I wouldn't expect the massive protests as well. I would rather look at the situation as a pro-Iranian situation. When there was an outbreak of war with Iraq, for example, the war with Iraq consumed about 700,000 lives in Iran, and still there was no protest and there was no revolution in Iran.
Yeah, but still, we know that recently British Defense Ministry says that Russian public support for the war is dropping. So what does it mean for you? How long Russians are really ready to support the war?
First, it doesn't matter much, because Russian public support for many things was very low when these things were implemented in Russia. Recall the increase of the pension age, for example. In Russia, the political structure allows Kremlin to go for the unpopular measures and still succeed. On the other hand, I suppose that the diminishing Russian support for war does not mean that the Russian population is ready to accept whatever result of the negotiations. Yes, they want peace, they want negotiations, but obviously they want the end of the war on their terms. And the alternative for the defeat would not still be a war adoption.
Andrei, thank you for your time, for your patience, and that you answered all these questions. I appreciate that you took part in this show. So, and I will be happy to see you one more time.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yes, thank you. So I will send you a link and we could share it.
I would appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you, and have a good day and be safe.
Yes, thank you. Keep in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah,
Goodbye.
bye. And I would like to remind you that today we have a guest, an economist and investment specialist, the founder of Movchan Group, Andrei Movchan. Thank you to be with us. And don't forget to be subscribed to Politeka World Show to be in the heart of the most important news about Ukraine.